Okay, we've got a few more people, I think, that are going to join us, but we'll get going now because obviously it's coming up to 10:05. Just like to say good morning to everyone and welcome to this first Ask the Academics Hidden Needs 3 webinar. I'm Michael Attwood. I'm the Head of Partnerships at Suffolk Community Foundation, and I'm going to be your host for today. We've got roughly 1 hour this morning, during which we're going to cover a presentation from Dr. Cristian Dogaru and Dr. Noel Smith, who are the academics behind this hidden needs research. And we're of course very thankful for all of their work in producing this detailed report. After the presentation, we're going to have a question and answer session. I'd just like to mention a few housekeeping points to begin with. During the session, participants are all on mute. And we kindly ask that if you have any questions arising from the presentation, that you use the text chat facility within Zoom to ask these questions. And then any questions that are asked, we'll collate and we'll endeavour to get through as many of them at the end of the presentation. I'm sure many of you would have tuned into our annual review, which was broadcast last week. But for the benefit of those that weren't able to view that, just like to say a few words about the Hidden Needs report. So Hidden Needs reports are vitally important to us as an organisation, but also for the wider Suffolk system. And of course, we know that Suffolk generally is a prosperous county, but similarly, we know that many people experience significant challenges in their everyday life. And the purpose of Hidden Needs really is to look deeper into the state of Suffolk and to identify where the challenges of deprivation and the forms of deprivation and the way that it takes its shape are distributed across the county. And it's intended really that the Hidden Needs report provides a greater level of awareness of those needs across the county, but also importantly, it's to inform our collaborative work. So that's collaboration between the private sectors, the public sectors and the voluntary sectors, so that we can collectively address those needs and make Suffolk the best place it can be for everyone. Now, without further ado, I think it's probably time that if I swiftly hand over to our academics, so Dr. Noel Smith and Dr. Cristian Dogaru, we have your presentation. If we can load that, please. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks for that introduction, Michael, and hello, everybody. So, yeah, my name's Noel Smith. Formerly of the University of Suffolk. I'm a visiting professor at the university. My main role now is as an independent researcher and consultant, working on various research projects and evaluations nationally and regionally. I know Cristian wanted to say a couple of words to introduce yourself.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Yes, my name is Cristian Dogaru. I work at the University of Suffolk right now. I'm an associate professor there, and I've been involved with the Hidden Needs report since the previous version.
Lovely. So I'm going to kick off. Mandy, could we have the first slide, please? Thanks very much. So this morning we wanted to start by just talking about the background of Hidden Needs and talking about the index of multiple deprivation. That's the predominant piece of analysis at the heart of Hidden Needs. So we want to talk about what the IMD, Index of Multiple Deprivation, what it is, what it's able to tell us, what the limitations are, what it doesn't tell us. Then I'm going to go on and talk about what we found out about the changing dynamics of neighbourhood level deprivation in Suffolk. The next thing, well, one of the really I'm a bit nerdy maybe, but one of the really exciting innovations about this Hidden Needs is Cristian's invention of a rural IMD. Deprivation nationally tends to get concentrated in urban areas, and so understanding deprivation in rural areas can sometimes get lost. And so Cristian's initiative kind of addresses that, so he'll talk through that. The main bulk of our presentation this morning is going to be talking about the key findings in terms of the different types of drivers of deprivation in Suffolk. Then I'll attempt to sum up and kind of indicate how the research might help us to think about addressing deprivation in Suffolk. And then obviously we'll have some time for some questions. So I hope that's what everybody's expecting. Mandy, can I have the next slide, please? So the background. Hidden Needs 3 is an analysis of changing deprivation in Suffolk over a 12-year period from 2007 to 2015. So we had the first Hidden Needs project, which was published in 2011, and that was undertaken by Cambridge University. And that looked at changes between the 2007 and the 2010 Index of Multiple Deprivation. The second Hidden Needs project was undertaken by Cristian and myself, and that looked at change between 2010 and 2015. So when we were asked to do the third Hidden Needs, it initially made sense of us just to look at changes between 2015 and 2019. But it quickly became apparent that this would kind of give a misleading view of changing deprivation in Suffolk. And the reason for that is that change between 2010 and 2015 is, well, it's quite modest. And if you were to look at that in isolation, it would suggest quite a stable picture. But if you take the view over the longer term, it's actually much more of a sort of a dynamic and fluctuating situation. So this short-term view we felt would actually hide this. And so that's why we've taken a longer view, which is really necessary to understand Suffolk better, to understand Suffolk properly. The second part of the background is that it's an index of multiple deprivation. Deprivation is multifaceted. It includes income, but it includes other things, health, education, housing, etc. Some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And if we're looking at change, we can't assume that all these different facets of deprivation are changing in the same way, to having the same effect on everybody. So this Hidden Needs report tries to unravel which aspects of deprivation have had the greatest impact and who they've had greatest impact for. In terms of the methodology, I've said that Hidden Needs 3 is predominantly driven by analysis of the government's Index of Multiple Deprivation, which it produces every 4 years or so. Our analysis also draws on a whole range of other data sets which help us to explore and explain what's going on in the Index of Multiple Deprivation. But given that the IMD is kind of at the heart of everything, I'm going to hand over to Cristian to tell us more about it. I think we need the new slide.
Yes, we'll need the next slide. Thank you very much, Noel. Yes, so before going into the results of this report of long-term changes in Suffolk, just a bit of a refresher of what the Index of Multiple Deprivation is, because this is the main data source for the study. So basically, this is, as Noel said, basically it's a score calculated by the government using multiple sources, and is released every four or 5 years. So the last one is 2015, and this is based on numerous sources of data. What's important to understand about the IMD, or Index of Multiple Deprivation, is that it is a score calculated at the geographical area. So they do not present data or information at individual level. It's geographical level. And this geography is what the Office of National Statistics calls a LSOA, Lower Super Output Area. We're going to call them neighborhoods. And an LSOA is a geographical area that has a similar population size, about 1,500 population or 800 households. So what the government does, they calculate a specific score based on a number of indicators I'm going to show you later. And then, so the higher the score, the more deprived the area is in that metrics. And then all the neighborhoods in England, all 32,844 are ranked from the most deprived, which gets rank number 1, to the least deprived. And then having them ranked, then you can divide them in like equal size groups. And so if you take 10 groups, so if you divide them in 10 groups, you can get what we call deciles. If you divide them by 5 groups, is quantile. So this is kind of the language we use in the report. So the neighborhood is this LSOA, and decile is this all the neighborhoods in England divided in 10. So if you can go to the next slide. If you can go to the next slide, please. Yes, so as you will see, this is a map of Suffolk, including all the neighborhoods. And as you can see, some of them look bigger, some of them look smaller, because they are not based on surface, they are not based on geographical size, but they are based on population size. So obviously those neighborhoods in the rural areas are bigger because it's more sparse population, but that's kind of the Suffolk map looks like. And if you move to the next slide, there's basically 7 domains, as they call them, that are used to calculate this index of multiple deprivation. Is the income, employment, education, skills and training, health, crime, barriers to housing and services, and living environment. So as Noel said, deprivation is constructed as having multiple dimensions, not only a single one, such as income. And if you move to the next slide, that's going to be a kind of a small print. I don't know how well you can see, but that's less important. You can see there's a number of areas or a number of domains that have been included in the calculation of each score. And the thing about index multiple deprivation is, because it's a ranking, when you say a specific neighborhood is in a specific decile, or is deprived or more deprived or less deprived, it means it's less deprived or more deprived compared with the rest of England. It's difficult to get an absolute measure of deprivation for the entire index. But this is pretty much what it is. So it's a complex measurement based on number of sources of data in those 7 domains. And I think I can switch back to Noel to look at some of the initial results.
Thanks, Chris. Mandy, the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So yeah, I just wanted to pick up here and just to lay out what we call the overarching dynamics. So kind of what's been the flow and change of deprivation in Suffolk over this period. And we can describe this in 3 ways. Here's one way of looking at it. There's been an increase in the proportion of neighbourhoods which are among England's most deprived deciles. And at the same time, there's been an increase in relative deprivation in the middle ground of the distribution. So what I've got here in these 2 charts is these show the spread of Suffolk neighbourhoods in terms of deprivation. And the dark blue are the neighbourhoods in the more deprived deciles. The light blue, it's the least deprived deciles. And obviously here it compares 2007 and 2019. And there's a couple of things to point out here. Firstly, if I take you down to those dark blue blocks, we can see that between 2007 and 2019, there's been an increase in the proportion of Suffolk neighbourhoods in the most deprived deciles. So in the very most deprived decile, an increase from 3.6% of neighbourhoods in Suffolk up to 5%. And if you do up a little bit, in the next decile, there's an increase from around 4% to over 6%. The second thing that's really interesting here is that if you look at the top graph, 2007, if you look there, the 7th and 8th decile, up towards the least deprived end, you can see that's where most neighbourhoods in Suffolk are concentrated. But then if you shift down to 2019, you can see that actually that concentration of neighbourhoods has shifted down to around the 5th and 6th decile. Now, this doesn't mean that if in the 5th and 6th decile that all these neighbourhoods have, you know, suddenly moved into extreme deprivation or anything. But what it means is that there's been an increasing proportion of people, of households in those neighbourhoods which have experienced various aspects of deprivation. Amanda, the next slide, please. So this dynamic is about how deprivation has changed between the three waves of the IMD that we've looked at. So this graph shows the proportion of neighbourhoods which have changed ranking by a decile or more, so it had a significant change. Where in that kind of turquoise blue, that's the neighbourhoods which have, the proportion of neighbourhoods which have improved by a decile or more, and in the red are the neighbourhoods which have declined by a decile or more. And what we see here is, so between 2007 and 2010, the first part of the chart, see there's been a significant decline in the sense that more than twice as many neighbourhoods declined as the proportion that increased. However, when we look at 2010 to 2015, we can see a much bigger decline. The red bar is much bigger than the blue bar. And this is really interesting because it coincides perfectly with the timescale of the last recession. You know, as Cristian said, the IMD is based on lots of data sets, and there's a lag between the time that the data is collected and that the IMD is put together. So the 2010 IMD is based on data mainly from 2008, which was just at the very beginning of the Great Recession, the 2008-2009 recession. And 2015 is based on findings from 2000. You need to go back one, Mandy. Is based on the 2013 data. So that's collected just about the time that the recession was drawing to an end. Now, it's hard to imagine that this big decline in Suffolk wasn't affected by the Great Recession. And it would be easy to sort of say, well, that's because of the Great Recession. But as Cristian said, the IMD is a relative thing. It's a relative measure of all the different neighbourhoods. Obviously, you know, all of England was affected by the recession. So if this decline is caused by the recession, or the extent to which that it's caused by the Great Recession, it would have to mean that Suffolk was hit harder by the recession than England was, than other places in England were on average overall. We don't know that, but it's an important question. The graph also shows us that when it comes to changes between 2015 and 2019, this is where there's kind of modest change. Actually, overall, it's weird, exactly the same proportion of neighbourhoods had increased their position in the deciles as the proportion who decreased. And this is the thing, if you look at that in isolation, it looks like a pretty stable situation. But if you look at the graphs overall, if you look at this slide as a whole, what it shows is that in 2010, 2015, there's been no big decline, but at the same time, there's been no recovery either from these earlier periods of decline. And next slide then, please. So the third dynamic is that we could say, well, you know, we're talking a lot about change and dynamics and movement in deprivation. But actually, most of that movement has happened in the middle ground of the distribution, so relatively less deprived neighbourhoods. That's where most changes happened. But when it comes to the very most deprived neighbourhoods, it's a different picture. And what this table shows us is that if we looked at those neighbourhoods which were in the most deprived decile in 2007, so among England's most deprived 10% in 2007, 75% of those neighbourhoods were still in the most deprived decile in 2019, and in fact had never moved out of that most deprived group. So they've been persistently deprived during that period. The situation for England overall is not much better, but it is still better. So of all of the most deprived neighbourhoods in 2007, 31 had experienced some improvement during that period, compared with only 25% in Suffolk. And what this means is that of concern is that extreme deprivation is much more persistent in Suffolk than it is on average overall for England. Cristian.
Okay, if we can move to the next slide. Thank you very much. So now we go back to that discussion about rural IMD versus urban IMD. Because we want to kind of unpick what's happening in rural Suffolk compared with the rest of England. But if you try to do that in the overall IMD score, we know from the data that urban neighborhoods tend on average to be more deprived than rural neighborhoods. So when you rank all the rural and urban neighborhoods in the same group, that can obscure the relative deprivation in the rural areas, because kind of the urban areas kind of take precedence and they show up stronger. And this is especially important in Suffolk, because Suffolk it's a quite a rural county with a high proportion of rural neighborhoods, 37%. So more than a third of Suffolk's neighborhoods are in a rural area. And if you look at the overall IMD, as it's being calculated by the government, including urban and rural areas, neighborhoods, we can see, now we can move to the next slide, that basically since 2007, none of the rural neighborhoods in Suffolk fell within that most deprived quantile. I'm talking now about the 20% most deprived in England. If it's calculated, as I said, including urban and rural. So it feels like, you know, it's doing quite well. But we want to unpick what's happening in rural Suffolk. And we said the best comparison is to compare with the rest of rural England instead of comparing with everything put together. So this is why we calculated, we can move to the next slide. We want to calculate, so what I did, in fact, I took all the scores and I ranked them the same way the official data was done in the general IMD, but using only rural neighborhoods in England. So basically, I created this rural IMD as how rural neighborhoods are ranked across England, and then we can say how Suffolk's rural neighborhoods look in comparison with rural England. And of course, I did the same thing with the urban. So I kind of did it separately. And based on, so we looked again at the data from this new approach, and indeed Suffolk experiences a bit less deprivation than rural England generally. It kind of mirrors the general IMD in Suffolk, but however, the number of rural neighborhoods that are relatively deprived in Suffolk is increasing, and the changes are spread across the distribution. And if you go to the next slide, I can explain a bit. So you see here the picture. If you look to the panel on the left, which shows the rural IMD in Suffolk, you see it's a bit different than the one I showed before. We see a proportion of rural neighborhoods, the most deprived quantile to the left, because we are actually now comparing only with rural neighborhoods in England. And you see there is an increase. It goes from about, it's the light purple, it's 2007, going to the dark purple, 2019. And you see here there is an increase in proportion from about 5% to almost 15% of rural neighborhoods being in the most deprived quantile. So it's a kind of a sharp increase. And you can also see kind of sharp changes at in the other quantiles. A sharp increase in the second quantile, and then a sharp decrease in the third quantile, which is a quantile of a less deprived compared with the rest of Suffolk. So the rural neighborhood kind of experiences this kind of more dynamic changes compared with urban. If you look at the panel on the right that shows urban Suffolk neighborhoods compared with urban in England, the changes are a bit less dynamic. So as I said, the idea is the changes are spread across the distribution in the rural area more than it's for the urban neighborhoods. I think we can move to the next one. That's going back to Noel.
Yes. So far, when Cristian and I have been talking about deprivation, we've been talking about the IMD's overall measure of deprivation. But in the research, we were really interested in looking kind of under the bonnet of that overall measure to these different aspects, these different domains or aspects of deprivation. Because what we wanted to find out is which particular aspects of deprivation were driving this overall deprivation measure. So we thought about drivers of deprivation in a couple of ways. First, here is we want to know what have been the long-standing, constant, most concentrated aspects of deprivation in Suffolk. And what we found out that there were three aspects of deprivation which have been more concentrated. That is, that a bigger proportion of neighbourhoods were in England's most deprived decile for these types of deprivation, compared with, as is the case for overall deprivation. So the three areas that we identified there were about children's education, geographical barriers, and we've talked about that. We'll talk about that later in terms of accessibility to services, and the indoors environment subdomain, which is around housing quality. So they're more concentrated than overall deprivation in Suffolk, but there's also a higher proportion of Suffolk neighbourhoods are in the most deprived group for these three areas than is the case for England overall. So that's a view of drivers as being concentrated. The next slide, Mandy, please. So the second way of looking at drivers of deprivation was to look at what types of deprivation have been increasing in Suffolk. And this table here tries to sum this up. So what it shows is percentage point net change. So it's the gap between the proportion of neighbourhoods which have improved or declined in terms of these various aspects of deprivation. So, for example, in terms of income, in that first line, more neighbourhoods declined than improved between each wave of the IMD. So there was a percentage point difference of 2.7 in terms of the proportion of neighbourhoods which declined in income deprivation between 2007 and 2010. And then if you go down there, income affecting older people, we can see that more neighbourhoods have improved than declined during between each wave of the IMD. And looking at this table as a whole, it shows us that there's been kind of a pattern of decline among a wide range of aspects of deprivation in Suffolk. When we look at this, we just need to be careful and remember that decline here, again, does not mean that neighbourhoods are plunging into deprivation. It often means instead that there's been this change in neighbourhoods in the middle ground of the deprivation. And what that prompts us to do is then think about, well, where is this change happening and who's being affected? And Mandy, the next slide. So if we go in to look at one of the first drivers around income and employment, this picks up exactly on these issues. So looking at this table, remembering that if income and employment deprivation was worse in Suffolk than in England, then over 10% of neighbourhoods would be in the most deprived decile. But you can see here, looking across this table, that that's not the case. So overall in Suffolk, deprivation related to income and employment is relatively low compared to England. On the other hand, if you look at this table, you can see that in all of these forms of deprivation, these three here, they've all been increasing in Suffolk. Income deprivation has increased from 2.7 to 3.4%. Income deprivation affecting children has increased from 1.1% of neighbourhoods in the most deprived decile up to 5%, etc. Importantly, our researchers also found that income and employment deprivation is actually much less an issue for the middle ground in the middle ground of the distribution. But these forms of deprivation are really concentrated in the most deprived neighbourhoods in the county, and that means that income and employment are important drivers for the most profound experiences of deprivation in Suffolk. And in Suffolk, that really means concentrated deprivation in Ipswich and Waveney in East Suffolk. And the next slide. So we can see this illustrated here. Now, the government's measure of child poverty is different to the index and multiple deprivations measure of income deprivation, but we can still see here the similar pattern, a pattern in which some of the highest rates of child poverty are in East Suffolk, and in Ipswich, child poverty rates have been persistently higher than the national average. So in 2018, 2019, a quarter of children in Ipswich were in child poverty. And then on next slide. Next slide. When it comes to unemployment, unemployment has always been lower than average in England. And this graph shows that the unemployment rate since 2006, so that's England in the murky green line and Suffolk in the blue. And then we can see that just at a glance that unemployment rates in Suffolk have always been lower than in England. Next slide. But given that unemployment rates have been generally lower in Suffolk, it's really interesting to note how this compares to youth unemployment. Again, we've got in this graph, we've got England in the red line and Suffolk in the blue line. As you can see here, that up to 2016, youth unemployment was relatively was less than the unemployment rate for England, but there was this change. So that from 2017 onwards, youth unemployment rate in Suffolk is around the same as the rate for England. Next slide. But probably more of an issue than unemployment in Suffolk is the issue of low wages. And we can see this at a glance in this graph. This shows average weekly pay since 2008, with England in the red and Suffolk in blue. And it's easy to see this on this table. Consistent problem of low pay in Suffolk. Gross average pay in 2019 was £37 less per week in Suffolk than England. And within Suffolk, pay has been lowest in Ipswich, Forest Heath and Waveney. In Waveney, where the gap has been biggest, the weekly wage in 2017 was £115 less than the average for Suffolk, and £151 a week less than for England. Cristian.
Okay, now if you look at another indicator of the multiple deprivation, which is education, this is another particularly important one for Suffolk, because Suffolk has also kind of specific dynamic with the education domain. First of all, it's quite concentrated in Suffolk. So if you look at IMD 2015, for example, over 18% of Suffolk neighborhoods are in the most deprived 10% across England. So it's more than you would expect based on if it was a kind of a equal distribution. So there is a bit of a change. There is a bit of an improvement. So in 2019, it's 14% compared with the 18% the previous wave, but it's still disproportionately high in Suffolk. So 14% of neighborhoods are among 10% most deprived neighborhoods across England. However, what's interesting is that all the Suffolk neighborhoods, 64 Suffolk neighborhoods that are among England's 10% most deprived in terms of education, only 17 are in the most deprived overall deprivation, most deprived neighborhoods, which actually shows, if you can move to the next slide, actually the neighborhoods, those neighborhoods that are most deprived, when you compare education deprivation across England, they are kind of spread out across most deprived, across neighborhoods in terms of general deprivation. So it shows that the education as a measure of deprivation is not only a problem in those most deprived generally. It's kind of spread out across the. So this table basically shows the quintiles in the overall IMD score, and you can see that 17%, only less than a third of those most deprived educationally fall within the first quintile, 36 in the second quintile, and so forth. So basically the message from this is that the education deprivation is not associated with the most deprived or overall. It's kind of spread out across the neighborhoods. And if we can move to the next slide, I'm also a bit aware of time. There are some areas of improvement. For example, GCSE attainment area rates have improved in Suffolk. Early years development measures have improved in Suffolk. But an area of concern in terms of education is that disadvantaged children in Suffolk schools have poorer attainment scores than other children. And even more importantly, if you compare disadvantaged children in Suffolk, they do less well than disadvantaged children in England. So even if you compare among children who are disadvantaged, those in Suffolk are doing less well. So if you move to the next slide, we can see, for example, if you look at on the left, pupils eligible for that's GCSE pupils eligible for free meals. The red line, which is Suffolk, it kind of tracks that of England, but it's constantly below. And on the right again, it's the reaching expected development among pupils eligible for free meals. Again, those in Suffolk are doing less well than those in England generally. So basically, overall, education seems to be it is a quite important factor in Suffolk, and it has this particular dynamic. It's not only focused in the most deprived neighborhoods overall, but it's a bit spread out across the other neighborhoods. And we can move to housing quality. I think that's Noel.
Cristian and I are really aware that we're kind of running over time, so we'll keep this brief. So we saw earlier that deprivation related to housing quality was one of those long-standing, more concentrated forms of deprivation in Suffolk. 16% of neighbourhoods in 2019 were in the most deprived decile for this measure. This map quickly shows where is that deprivation based? Well, unlike things like income and employment, the most deprived areas are not in the urban areas, not in Ipswich, not in Waveney. But instead they're concentrated in rural areas. The dark blue on this map show the most deprived neighbourhoods on this measure. And this can be explained by the fact that the IMD's measure of housing quality was based a lot on energy efficiency, the thermal comfort of homes, and that we know that older rural houses tend to be more expensive to heat, harder to heat than houses in towns. And that kind of alerts us to one of those hidden needs we've said is that in relatively, could be affluent, advantaged rural neighbourhoods, you are going to find households who are facing fuel poverty. And indeed, the 2018 Suffolk County Council reported that, for example, over 10% of households in mid-Suffolk were in fuel poverty. And of course, with fuel poverty comes a whole set of associated risks to well-being and health. And I'll just pick up on housing costs. Next slide, please. This is an interesting area because on the one hand, there's no neighbourhoods in Suffolk are in the most deprived decile for when it comes to in this area. But on the other hand, it's been one of the really quickly fastest increasing areas of relative deprivation in Suffolk. And what this reflects is that house prices have been increasing in Suffolk faster than they have for England, but especially for lower cost housing, so what's technically referred to as lower quartile housing. Between 2007 2019, lower quartile house prices in Suffolk have increased by 39%, compared with 28% in England, so quite a lot more. And then that's exacerbated when low wages are thrown in. This graph shows the ratio of lower quartile house prices to lower quartile wages. And just what it shows that, especially since 2013, if you're on a lower wage, you're having to pay more on housing in Suffolk than you would in England generally. And there's similar findings for rented accommodation. It's an issue. I'm going to pass back to Cristian just to say a few words about accessibility.
Yes, thank you, Noel. So accessibility, or how is it called in the IMD language, the geographical barriers, it's a measure of how easy it is to access specific services like a school, post office, food shops, and GP surgeries. So basically, the score on this is calculated kind of an average distance to those services. And Suffolk performs particularly poorly on this. So the bigger the distance or average distance, the most deprived an area is considered in the ranking. So more than a quarter of the neighborhoods in England, they fall within England's 10% most deprived. And obviously this is the rural characteristics in Suffolk. If you remember my first map with those LSOAs in rural areas are quite large geographically. And in rural areas, the distances are greater to those services indeed. So in 2019, more than half of the rural neighborhoods in Suffolk were in the most deprived decile on this particular measure of geographical barriers, accessibility. And that's also true if you look at only at rural IMD. The barriers to services in rural Suffolk are greater than in England generally. And you can see that on the next slide. On the left, you see the map of Suffolk with it shows the areas, darker blue, that are more deprived in terms of geographical barriers across Suffolk. And you can see how they map most of the rural areas. And as I said, more than a quarter of Suffolk neighborhoods you see on the right panel, consistently across the different waves are in the most deprived 10% across England. However, if we move to the next slide, this geographical barrier is an interesting one because it doesn't seem to be the driver or a driver of deprivation in general. And actually, if you compare the neighborhoods who are more deprived in terms of the distance to the geographical barriers, they tend to be located in the less deprived areas if you look at the overall deprivation. And basically what it says, those geographical areas that are more deprived in terms of barriers to services, distances to services, they tend to be inhabited by people, because they are in the rural areas, they tend to be inhabited by relatively wealthy households. So they got good income, they're wealthier people, so for them probably, even if the distances to different services is greater, would not be such a big problem. But however, those areas can include those islands of kind of the hidden needs, islands of people who are not doing as well, but also they've got this extra obstacle of accessing services. So that's an example of those kind of the hidden need examples in the bigger picture of Suffolk. Okay, so I think we can move to one of the concluding slides.
Well, I'm going to just try and finish off here quickly. So the research has showed us that Suffolk is in, it's not one of the most deprived places in England, and we shouldn't run away with that idea, but neither is it particularly advantaged. We've got this concentration of neighbourhoods around the middle ground of the distribution of deprivation. And what our long view shows us is kind of this kind of unsettling, gradual, long-term decline and increase in relative deprivation. It's concerning that the most deprived neighbourhoods haven't been improving. That persistence there is a source of concern. And there's been this increase in relative deprivation in that middle ground. What that means is that there are more families, perhaps more households who are struggling to manage, and then perhaps less resilient to financial shocks or difficult times ahead. Deprivation is multifaceted. I hope we've kind of illustrated that there's lots of factors at play. And what we need to be clear about is that to address deprivation, we need to address the different aspects of deprivation. We need to address each of those aspects. And that makes it a really complex challenge. And in the report, we've kind of avoided proposing any sort of trite answers or simplistic solutions. The conclusion of the report is really meant to speak to the Suffolk Community Foundation. And through thinking through all these different drivers of deprivation, it starts setting out a roadmap or a theory of change for tackling deprivation. And in that sense, it makes it's meant as a guide for the foundation and how the foundation might prioritise its grant making. We can push this further. Given the complex, multifaceted nature of deprivation, it's clear that it can't be tackled by any one organisation, but really kind of requires that whole system coordinated approach. And there is lots of work, obviously, lots of really important work that is happening. So what we've tried to do in the conclusion is sketch out how such a theory of change might be useful for articulating how the different initiatives and strategies that are already in play in Suffolk can be understood as overlapping and collaborating to tackle multiple deprivation in the country and to think through where the gaps might be. Michael, back to you.
Thank you very much, Noel and Cristian. That was really, really interesting. And I think hopefully everyone else has found that to be really interesting. We've received a number of really good questions, which we'll now take the time to go through. So I've been, where possible, trying to build a list of these. And I'll just see if I can share my screen and then we'll run through them all one by one. Okay. I might have to read the questions out then because it's not letting me share my screen. So if we just go to the first question then, and this was a question that was submitted before the event. So the question was, early on in the report, there is a narrative around ethnicity and aging population, but then the rest of the report doesn't reference deprivation affecting BAME groups. Is this because of the way that the IMD collects and presents data at a spatial level, as opposed to, say, the census, which has more detailed information on the composition of households?
I think I can answer that question, and the answer is in a short yes, indeed. IMD data refers to characteristical geographical areas, and it does not, the way it's being collected and the way it's being reported does not differentiate between different types of households in terms of ethnic background. So we can only infer indirectly. So if we know that in a specific neighborhood there's a higher proportion of ethnic minority households, then we can infer indirectly that those are affected more directly, but not directly from the IMD. It's just a matter of how it was collected and how it was measured.
Okay, thank you. So the next question. The report shows that, relatively speaking, Suffolk is becoming more deprived. Do you think this is down to a worsening of deprivation amongst the most deprived parts of Suffolk, or is it more because of a decline in the more prosperous areas?
I think I can take that question as well. It's probably both, actually. It's probably both. So as we've seen in the presentation, the most deprived areas tend not to improve, but it doesn't mean they are not getting worse either. They're just kind of lumped in the most deprived area, and we've also seen that the kind of slow decline of those areas that are less deprived. So probably the dynamic is it's covering all. It's probably both.
Okay, thank you. So the next question. The report speaks of an increase in deprivation within rural areas, with housing quality and access to services cited as being drivers for this. What would cause this decline over the last few years, and why is it becoming more of an issue now?
Okay, so I talk about it's tricky to understand that, and we can only make some informed suggestions. First, rural areas are going to be affected by many of those underlying issues, such as low wages and other things. But we found those, on top of that, in addition to that, there was three specific angles. The right accessibility, those issues about housing quality, with attendant issues about housing, fuel poverty, and house prices. Now, with accessibility, the IMD operates in quite narrow measures. So it looks at the distance from neighbourhoods to particular services, post offices, GPs, schools, and it uses these as indicators of accessibility. What we know is that, for instance, from 2007, there's been lots of post office closures in county. Many of those have been in rural areas. And of course, when a post office closes down, it's not just a post office, it's, in a rural area, it's going to be the village shop, it's going to be the garage, it's going to be a hub and a resource. And so that's really important. The decentralisation of services that happens where any period where there's been cuts in public services are also likely to have an impact there. Housing quality, made the point that actually this is driven, I think, a lot by the thermal efficiency of housing in Suffolk, and it reflects the very rural nature of Suffolk, why deprivation has increased so much. Now, what's driving that as a relative problem is either got to be one of two things. It's either got to be older rural properties in the county are somehow harder to make efficient than housing elsewhere, or it could be that there's not been a concerted focus or strong enough focus on addressing thermal efficiency. And of course, Suffolk Community Foundation's Surviving Winter campaign is one of those really, you could see the need for that. It really illustrates the importance of that. The house prices, there is an issue, I think, about the availability of affordable housing. And in the report, you'll see a graph that shows that based on figures that we have for 2018 and 2019, the rate at which affordable housing in Suffolk was being built has declined since before the last recession in 2008 and 2009, and hasn't increased to pre-recession rates. Now, whether that's true now, but clearly increasing house prices has got to be affected to some degree by availability.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question. How do you think the current economic downturn may affect Suffolk in terms of deprivation, and do you think that it will affect Suffolk more or less than other parts of the country this time around?
That's a really good question, and obviously we spent a lot of time putting the report together thinking about this. Well, we've already had one recession during COVID. I'm not an economist, we're apparently out of it, but we may well enter another one, or an extent, the next bit of the same one. The last recession has obviously been mitigated by furlough, and when furlough is eventually lifted, we know that that's going to have an impact on jobs. It's a really tricky thing to predict. I'm not an economist, but I've spoken to economists who don't want to predict things. If this recession has the same impact as the last recession on Suffolk, then it could well be that it will have a greater impact in Suffolk than it has in England generally. I really mean that with a degree of being tentative, but there is a possibility for that Suffolk needs to be prepared for. In terms of some of the specifics, I think there's likely to be three effects that you can associate with recessions. One is cuts to public spending, further cuts to public spending. You could see that will have an immediate effect on social care and well-being, but depending on how the government, central government takes that forward, could even have effects on education and health. Second thing is about unemployment. Remembering that unemployment after the 2008-9 recession took until 2014 to return to the same pre-recession rates. It will take so it has a long-term impact. In Suffolk, where there are fewer jobs, it's likely to mean that wages are suppressed, further suppressed. And the third thing, and this is something I think is quite concerning, is about youth unemployment. Youth unemployment, remember, is not lower now than it is nationally. So we're already quite vulnerable to youth unemployment. Young people always get hit hardest by recessions. That's kind of one thing that we do know. I know that it has been predicted that there's a chance that youth unemployment could triple because of the current recession, and even take us to 1980s level of recession. So I think that that's something that we probably need to look at quite carefully.
Okay, thank you. The next question. What is the evidence or level of social isolation and loneliness in the report, and how is it being measured? I'll
pick that up too. The IMD doesn't measure loneliness as one of the domains or aspects of deprivation. We could get into surmising about kind of what things that will increase loneliness, such as costs of accessibility, costs of transport, low income. Arguably, we should include loneliness in when we're looking at deprivation, because we know that it has an impact, a significant impact on health and well-being, and it's actually one of the key priority areas for the Suffolk and Norfolk integrated care system. And we know that it's an issue. Just in the summer, Age UK found that there were 10% of older people in Suffolk, that's 17,000 people, who experienced loneliness. And we know that younger people are affected by loneliness too. We've got a chance to maybe address that with the census next year. The census doesn't ask specifically about loneliness or social isolation, I think, but it does. It gives a set of indicators that help us to predict loneliness in areas. And then the census then would, because it's local, we could apply that to local areas, could give us some really important information about the dynamics of loneliness in Suffolk. Okay,
thank you. Moving on to the next one. How can the number of people who are experiencing invisible vulnerability be quantified? I.e., if they are off everyone's radar, how can these people be accounted for?
I think I can pick that question. And first of all, it's quite difficult to assess the exact number of people who might experience invisible vulnerability, and especially in the IMD measurement, is not reflected directly. And indeed, the definition of invisible vulnerability could be broad and take many different forms. However, by understanding the levels and distribution of deprivation in general, we can start to understand where people with certain vulnerabilities may be more likely to reside. And then we can work with the public and voluntary sector to kind of target and gain greater insights into the numbers of such people. So you can by understanding where they might reside, then you can try to gain more insight into that. The existing measures, especially the ones in the IM, cannot really reflect those people experiencing invisible vulnerability, probably because it's invisible in a sense. Yeah.
Okay. The next one is, can we take it that areas that suffer the worst deprivation will increase further post COVID-19?
Well, if the pattern persists, the one what we've seen kind of the long term, it is likely that they will, if not decreasing further, at least not improving, because we've seen that those who are more deprived tend not to improve.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Do you feel some of your research or findings could significantly change due to COVID-19?
Yes. Well, I think this comes back to that issue of the impact on the economy. I mean, that's going to be the biggest single driver. It could also, we talked about loneliness. We know that there are a number of services and shops and businesses which are going to be hit, and that has an impact on unemployment and income, but it also has an impact on things that may not be picked up on the IMD, but in terms of access to services and opportunities for people.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, does there need to be some open Suffolk Community Foundation or University of Suffolk seminar to explore specifically the theory of change framework and what needs to happen, who and how? Now that one, I'll probably answer that one. We are really, really keen that we can use Hidden Needs 3 to promote a multi-sector response to the challenges that Suffolk faces. So whilst we haven't got any seminar as such sort of specifically planned at the moment, we are definitely going to be exploring how we can collectively work better together to respond to the issues that have been raised. The next question is, has correlation between specific actions in an area and change in figures being looked at?
I think I can answer that, and the short answer is no, not for this report. So this report was more of a descriptive what's there, but it's definitely something we can look at, because now that we identify areas where deprivation is high or it doesn't change, then we can look at other sources of data and we can kind of put it in context and take this longitudinal view, saying where if some action has been in place, did it make a difference? So it's definitely possible to do that indeed.
Thank you. The next question is, or it's a sort of question and a statement, I suppose. This is a story of Suffolk being in a slow lane and losing ground. The incoming money from retirees is disguising a more endemic problem. What is the response of policymakers to this failure, and are they open to any kind of discussion? And I'll probably take that one as well, I think. So
Okay.
it's much the same sort of response really to the one that I spoke of a few moments ago, in that there is definitely a appetite amongst certainly the public sector and I think the voluntary sector to work better together and to better understand sort of policy issues that may have led to some of the increases in deprivation or the improvements in other areas from taking place. So there is definitely a real desire, I think, now for people to work together. And we've seen, I think, one of the products of the COVID-19 pandemic has been a much stronger partnership approach to dealing with things at the local level. So I think there's definitely some sort of light in the future in that respect. The next question. Is there any evaluation of pupils with an education healthcare plan and the areas of deprivation?
I don't know. It's a simple answer to that question. I don't know if Cristian's aware of it. It's something that we could have a look for.
I'm not aware of something like that yet, but it's definitely it can be done again, because if you can identify those areas that are more deprived, then we can look at least. But again, we have to remember those are geographical characteristics, so we should not extrapolate to individual level. But we can look at those areas, maybe the proportion of people or of pupils with education healthcare plans. So it's something that can be looked at indeed.
Thank you. I don't know if the next question listed is a question. It's more of a point being made there, I think, which is that poor accessibility in rural communities will impact greatly on unpaid carers in those areas, and that it's helpful to know when there are so many competing calls for support for carers. It would be good to be able to flag the risks associated with this.
I'll just make a couple of comments on that question. One, these are things to look out for going forward. One is that it relates to that social isolation and loneliness question, something that I think that the next census, which is coming out next year, will help us with, is that we know that there are huge numbers of people in Suffolk who are carers. Many of those are older people, and many of those are quite older people, 75 plus, and that combination of being an older carer who is isolated is, you don't need to be clever to realise that that's a really risky and difficult area. So that's one thing. The second thing is about what's the government going to do about public spending, and then at the central level, how that's fielded at the local level, because there are, and it's a question for the Suffolk Community Foundation. Actually, what gives so many unpaid carers support are local community organisations out in towns and villages, and they need to be recognised as providing that hugely important, I hate to say, but cost efficient service. If you support you support carers, you're supporting people who can manage care in their own homes without having to for people to lose their independence through going into care or hospital. I think if you erode the support for carers in the community, then it's something that is just creating lots of unnecessary problems and costs.
Okay, thank you. What looks like being potentially the last question, accessibility to services is rapidly being adversely impacted by lack of access to the technology to access the services that are increasingly only online. This is due to either poor internet or income deprivation bringing lack of access. This can be rural and urban, so will this get worse?
And Cristian, do you have a
well, I think this is a very, very good point indeed. And if I were the government, I would include the technology deprivation indicator in calculated IMD, because that's not captured, and that's increasingly significant. And indeed, I think we know that the broadband coverage is problematic, especially in rural areas. I don't know exactly how that, if that improved or not in the past years, and that's compounded, of course, with the income deprivation. So probably we can look at that, getting data from different other sources. Whether it's going to get worse, well, it depends. If the infrastructure related to the data, broadband and wireless doesn't improve, it's probably going to get worse, because as we've seen from the pandemic, the technology was, all being, working from home, lockdown and all that was quite, it's quite an important, it's going to become even more important. So investment in technology, in communication technology, is going to be a key factor. And again, it's not directly measured in the IMD, but we can see how it's going to impact overall deprivation if it's not addressed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, everyone, I think we'll probably draw things to a close now then. I've not received any more questions. So just once more, we'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all very, very much for taking part in the webinar. I hope you've all found it really, really interesting and insightful. I've put my email address in the chat, and if anyone has any subsequent questions or thoughts or any comments that they wish to make on the Hidden News report, its findings, or indeed, what is being done to take things forward, I would really be open to dialogue. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you.